the key features is that we learned how this muscle, the soleus, can use about 300% of the energy level that it would be using if you were exercising on a treadmill. For example, if you were jogging on a treadmill. So it means that this muscle can use much more energy with this specific movement called the Soleus Pushup than if you were standing or walking or even running on a treadmill.
Welcome to the Siim podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Marc Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton is a professor of biology and biochemistry at the University of Houston. He's the creator of the exercise called the Soleus Pushup. The soleus is a special type of muscle underneath your calf muscles that Marc and his team discovered to have a unique effect on the metabolism. In a 2022 study by Marc and colleagues, they found that stimulating the soleus muscle with the Soleus Pushup while sitting for several hours was able to lower the blood sugar levels to an oral glucose challenge by 52%. The interesting thing about the soleus muscle is that it's indefatigable, which means that you can stimulate it for several hours every day without getting tired. It essentially looks like a seated calf raise, but there are some nuances to doing it correctly, which we will all discuss in this episode. Marc is very passionate and scientific about this topic, so he likes to explain this very thoroughly. But I promise to you, if you listen to this until the end, you'll have several epiphany moments when it comes to exercise, walking, and the mighty soleus. Dr. Hamilton, welcome to the show.
It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show, and the reason I wanted to invite you was you published this kind of really exciting and almost like groundbreaking study a few years ago about the soleus muscle and how it has kind of an interesting effect on glucose metabolism and just overall health. So yeah, I'm like really keen to like go into all the details of that muscle. So maybe we can start with you giving like a brief overview of what did you find in the study and how did you conduct it?
Well, I think that the main point, first of all, is not even what we found in this one specific study. I mean, there's a number of studies that we conduct that deal with this general topic, and I think that the big news was really in being able to understand that the human soleus muscle has inherent properties that, if used the correct way, can have some outsized effects on the body. So, you think about the fact that the soleus weighs about 1 kilogram, or, roughly 1% of the body weight is able to have these outsized effects on the rest of the whole body. And that was unexpected. And frankly, it wasn't even the initial purpose of our research. And so I'll be glad to discuss that with you. But it was, the paper that you've read, was downstream of several other, lines of research that my lab had been doing, where we could test this hypothesis that soleus contractions by themselves, could have quite meaningful effects on the body in numerous ways. And you are right. You pointed out that one of those is improving glucose tolerance.
Right. And as I recall, then the effect was pretty big in those people who were training it.
That's right. And so the particular study you're looking at was with the immediate benefits of soleus contractions. So when people think about muscle metabolism, one of the most important principles is something that remarkably is almost never discussed. And it's not a controversial thing. It's just a simple fact of nature, which is that muscle metabolism at rest is relatively low, meaning that 1 kilogram of muscle has an imperceptible effect on your whole body, caloric expenditure or glucose utilization or fat use. And even the entire body's muscle mass, which is, muscle can be the largest tissue in the body, but because each kilogram of muscle has a very low metabolic rate, its contribution to total body metabolism is somewhat attenuated by that. So if you think about muscle, think about it like a machine, and the machine needs fuel. And when the machine is not running, it's not working, it's going to use very little fuel compared to when it's working. And other tissues aren't so much that way. The brain, for example, is always using a lot of energy, even when you're asleep. It's processing, doing things. The heart's pumping 24/7. The kidneys are always filtering and working. But skeletal muscle is unique in that humans have voluntary control over the metabolic rate of muscle by what you're doing. And what we said was that a fundamental problem currently, and when I say currently, I mean in the last 50 years in humans, is that we sit a lot, and when we sit, our muscles are inactive. And when our muscles are inactive, they're not contributing as much as they could to metabolism. So when I mentioned that there's this immediate benefit on health, what we're really saying is, how can we sustain muscle metabolism's effects at much better levels than just ordinary as sitting when we're resting, or it could be lying down. And even if you exercise and you do more than the average person, you still are going to spend most of your time by far sitting inactive and not out exercising. And so that's what we were interested in testing was how much does one need to raise metabolic rate of muscle? And we can put it in units of how many, for example, milligrams per minute does muscle need to burn of glucose, or how many milligrams per minute of lipoprotein derived fat, the stuff that causes heart disease and bad aging. How much do we need to be burning? And those types of answers are dependent upon the machinery that's doing the work. And so you can imagine that some types of muscle have very good machinery for extracting blood glucose and breaking down blood lipids that cause heart disease and stroke and so on. Whereas other muscles are relatively deficient in that same type of machinery. It depends on what the muscles are there for, the quality of the muscle. And the soleus is unique, and it's a remarkable fact is that it's unique in all species that it's been studied. So humans being one type of animal, but then there's many other animals that the soleus has been studied in. And in all those animals, the soleus stands out. It's different than other muscles. And we should talk about that. And everybody, that one of the big take home points should be, what are the distinct features of the soleus? That's point one. And then point two would be, is it always contributing? And the short answer is no. It's not always using that machinery, like I said before. And when the soleus is working, it's going to contribute more. And then the third point is really the most important contribution, I guess, that we should talk about, which is it all types of muscular activity having equal effects, or is there a specific type of way of working the soleus? And the short answer to that is that's what we did with this specific type of contraction actually does have a very different metabolic energy demand than, say, walking or bicycling or running, those types of exercises. And this way of intensely targeting the soleus. And even though it's not a high effort activity because you're not using other muscles, this muscle, when used this way, doesn't fatigue. And that's unusual. Every other muscle will fatigue. But when used this way at a high intensity, you can sustain the activity. And the muscle itself, though, is at a cellular level is working very hard. But you just don't feel it. Sort of like your heart right now is working quite hard. It's doing a lot. Right. But you don't feel it because the heart has the machinery for doing that. And so that's really part of the science here that we tried to develop.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Like that you mentioned that muscle is kind of inactive most of the time. It doesn't have a lot of energy expenditure at rest, which, there's the saying that having more muscle increases your basal metabolic rate, which is, true to a certain extent. But if you look at the studies, then it's not like a massive amount. It's not like hundreds of calories. It's maybe like
very low.
Like, a few dozen or something like that. So you need to still move the muscle to kind of burn the energy.
And it's frankly, like I said at the outset of our conversation, that's something that should be widely understood and appreciated. It's one of those kind of facts that can be measured well. And it applies to all species. There's nothing unusual about one individual or another person. And so the numbers are that the entire body's muscle mass, added together can contribute a meaningful amount, but not a dominant amount to your total energy expenditure. And remember, it's really not the calorie unit that we care so much about when we talk about healthy aging. What we really care about are specific substrates. And so we think about, for example, blood glucose a lot. But we also think about the lipoproteins that are in the blood, especially the triglyceride and cholesterol-rich lipoproteins that are in LDL and VLDL lipoproteins. And the way we metabolize that glucose or those specific kind of lipids is going to have a huge impact on a host of factors, certainly cardiovascular health, but also processes that are impacted by inflammation, processes that are important for everything from how your eyes function to the rest of your body. And so muscle has a choice. It can choose between a variety of substrates. And in fact, muscle is very adaptable in that way. It can select different fuels. But one important fuel, in fact, probably the most important fuel for muscle that when a muscle's exercising is these intracellular muscle glycogen. And that is a carbohydrate it's a big polymer, and it's stored inside of the muscle. And you can think about it like a bunch of glucoses that are stuck together. And that's by far the predominant carbohydrate that muscle uses when it's exercising, when it's working. And variety of studies, typically about 95% of all the carbohydrate that's broken down during exercise is coming from this intramuscular glycogen, not from blood glucose. So blood glucose is typically a bit player. It's not a major fuel from working muscle. And one of the key features of Soleus contractions when doing the Soleus pushup, and I must say, when doing that, that's more than a minor caveat, meaning that studies have looked at Soleus glycogen use during treadmill walking, for example. And the Soleus can use a lot of glycogen, like other muscles. But during this activity, there's really a minimal amount, negligible amount of glycogen use. So you can imagine if normally it's accounting for up to 90% of that carbohydrate use, and now it's not accounting but for about 4%, that opens up the door to the Soleus saying, give me another fuel. I can use something else. And in the case of an oral glucose tolerance test, we challenge the body with some carbohydrate. Simply, you can ingest, for example, 75 grams of glucose, and then look at the glucose excursions in the blood. Now the Soleus has what we would call metabolic flexibility, and it can turn on those processes for extracting and combusting that glucose in the blood as a fuel. And so that's part of the reason why we saw these outsized effects, because it means that a small amount of tissue can have a larger effect than even a large amount of tissue can have, because it has the machinery and it's using that machinery for extracting that glucose in that situation.
This episode is brought to you by Bond Charge, my favorite company for blue blocking glasses, red light therapy devices, and red light bulbs. These items are essential for keeping your sleep-wakefulness cycles aligned in a world that tries to mess them up. Instead of looking at your phone before bed and letting the blue light disrupt your melatonin production, why not wear blue blockers instead that prevent that from happening? Instead of having your bedroom lit up with bright lights, use the more sleep-friendly alternative by opting for flicker-free red light bulbs that don't disrupt your sleep. Bond Charge also has amazing infrared sauna blankets that can give you the same health benefits as the traditional sauna. You also get the unique benefits of infrared light that improves joint and skin health. Head over to bondcharge.com/Siim and use the code SIIM, SIIM, for a 15% discount. Maybe we can take a step back and talk about what is the Soleus, or
Okay.
specifically where is it?
Sure.
Because people think it's a calf muscle, but it's not really that.
Yeah. Well, it's in the lower leg. It's in the back side of the calf. And so, humans are bipedal. We walk on two legs, and most animals walk on four legs. And so it's in the hind limb of cats and rats, for example. The big difference in the human is that our calf muscle is predominantly the Soleus muscle. And in the quadrupeds, the Soleus is a very small, little, thin muscle. And in humans, the reason maybe we don't talk about it as much or think about it is it's a deep muscle, meaning that it's right next to the bone of your lower leg. And so there's the gastrocnemius muscle. There's actually two gastrocnemius muscles, one on the lateral head and one's the medial head. And those are those two little small muscles at the top of your calf. And they're shapely, right? And but they're sitting on top of the soleus, and the soleus is underneath it. But the soleus is actually a much thicker muscle, broader muscle, and then also it's a longer muscle, so 3 times as long as the gastrocnemius. So it goes all the way down to the Achilles tendon, where the gastrocnemius stops midway down your calf. So the soleus, like I said, is about half a kilogram per leg, total about 1 kilogram. And we quantify that with a MRI imaging using standard techniques, and others have done the same. And, but you know, while it's not a big component of our body weight, you know, as I've said before, maybe 1%, it actually is an enormous muscle, compared to Soleus in other species. If it hadn't been so big in humans, it probably this technique that we use probably wouldn't work. And there's other features about the soleus that we should have said, which is one is that it historically is referred to as what we'd call red, oxidative, slow twitch, type 1 muscle fibers. All those words are referring to the fact that we can categorize different muscles by their qualities. And those qualities in science are called the phenotype of the muscle. So you can look at how fast the muscle contracts versus how much endurance it has, or how much mitochondria it has for oxidative metabolism. And there's hundreds of variables that have been looked at with different muscle fiber types. And the soleus is even special compared to other type 1 or slow twitch muscles. And it's distinct in, for example, in anatomical reasons. Its muscle fibers are relatively short, and they're sort of shaped like a feather, in that there's this pennation of the fibers, and meaning that the fibers don't run all the way from the top of the muscle to the bottom of the muscle. And that seems like kind of a minor point when we talk about it on a podcast, but it's really a major point when you think about real life, because it means that the soleus is going to be able to pack in a lot more fibers for a given weight. And so it's and then you say, well, who cares about that? Well, you care about it when you have to stand and walk. And you can imagine that when you put your entire body weight on one leg, and then you have to lift your body weight up, that one muscle is having to take on an enormous amount of effort to keep you upright and balanced. And you can imagine that if you're a quadruped, you've got 4 legs instead of one leg at a time to do the job. And so it's a very strong muscle, and like I said, relatively big compared to other muscles in humans. And what we didn't know was well, okay, so it's bigger. That's just an anatomical thing. How can we get the most juice out of it? How can we really get it to work hard? And that was a lot of the science that we did. And we started the work in animals, and we continued it in humans, and we did a whole series of studies and writing papers literally this morning that we've done. And I'll just give you the bottom line, and we can get to the details as you ask questions. But that one of the key features is that we learned how this muscle, the soleus, can use about 300% of the energy level that it would be using if you were exercising on a treadmill. For example, if you were jogging on a treadmill. So it means that this muscle can use much more energy with this specific movement called the Soleus push-up than if you were standing or walking or even running on a treadmill.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that you maintain your entire body weight with even standing on one leg, as with this one small muscle kind of.
And you never even think about it, do you? It doesn't wear you out. Imagine if you were doing another kind of activity, like let's say a push-up, where you lay down on your belly and you put your hands down by your chest to push up with your arms. Most people do that for 30 seconds and they're worn out. And so those muscles aren't really well built for high endurance type of activities. But even your thigh muscles, which are quite big and strong, they're good for some things, but the kind of fuels they use and the endurance they have aren't quite the same as the Soleus. But again, I don't want anybody to get the misimpression. And there have been people who have thought otherwise, is that it really comes down to the right muscle doing the right activity. And in this case, there's more than one reason. I'll just give you one because it's very easy to understand. It's very easy for everybody to remember. Which is that when you're working a very small amount of your muscle mass, like the case of the Soleus by itself, and you're not working those big thighs and big hips and so on, that means that there's not a competition between these different muscles for oxygen or for fuels. It also means that the heart's not having to speed up heart rate a lot in order to deliver all that extra blood to all these tissues. And some people say, well, so what? That's just basic science. Well, not really, not in the real world, because what it means is that when you're working that muscle in isolation, the Soleus at least, it's not competing for all that oxygen and blood flow, and your heart rate's not getting up high. So you don't feel like you're doing a lot. And it can have a much better cardiovascular and metabolic response by itself than when the rest of the tissues are working. You can imagine, for example, when heart rate gets up really high, that there are some hormonal changes that go on to do that. And that is one of the processes, just give it as an example. Some of those hormones that are helping to stimulate heart rate during heavier exercise are also changing the fuels that you use, meaning that it alters whether you can use blood glucose or fat or that intramuscular glycogen. And glycogen use is sensitive to that. And so that's just one factor. It's not the only, but it's a easy one to understand that there's not this big, what we call homeostatic disturbance of the body. And so that the Soleus can really, do some impressive things when it's working by itself.
Gotcha. So how does the Soleus push-up then look like?
Yeah.
So that we can give people some already existing explanation.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't look like a lot when you look at it. And a lot of times what you see is not always what's happening, right? And so if you were to look at what's going on in your ankle, for example, when you're walking, what you would see is that you put your heel down on the ground, the beginning of a step, and that then your whole foot is lying relatively flat on the ground. And at that point, the Soleus would be working really hard, meaning that the motor neurons that activate that muscle would be sending these electrical signals such that the muscle would be engaged, the Soleus. Now, what's really important, and this is actually an interesting story to explain how we developed this paper, was that when you're doing that step with walking, at the end of the step, when your heel starts to rise, that's when your ankle is bending, right? And then you're actually propelling the body forward. That ankle is bending forward. So you can picture the end of the step as that heel's coming up. And it's a very powerful movement to take a person that might weigh 80 kilograms or more and move them forward like that. Well, the fact is, though, it's a relatively passive process, meaning that big Achilles tendon that we have that connects our heel to our Soleus and the gastrocnemius, that big Achilles tendon is like a stretchy spring in a way. And that when we're propelling ourselves during walking, that first part of the step, when the Soleus is activated and engaged and your ankle is not in that sort of shortening position, it's actually tugging tight on that spring we call the Achilles tendon. And then at that end of the step is when that spring recoils and there's this release of energy. And so you can passively cause the heel to go up off the ground and passively push you forward. So the body is built in a beautiful way to conserve energy, essentially. That way we can walk with using less energy than otherwise. And so the Soleus is certainly raising its energy demand some but not as much as you think. And that's why I said before that we can actually have a higher energy demand locally by this muscle when you're sitting. And the reason for that is when you're sitting, you're now you don't have all this body weight on that stretchy tendon, the Achilles tendon. Instead, what you're doing is you're sitting, and then you teach the research volunteers how to, they're sitting with a knee bent, right? Just like normal chair sitting. You've got your foot under your knee, not too far out in front of you. And, then the people will contract or activate their soleus muscle. You're not lifting the whole leg, meaning that you're not using your hip and your thigh at all. You want to isolate the activity so that all you're doing is bending that ankle forward. And what happens then is the heel's coming up and the top of your foot is starting to press forward. It's a very simple type of looking motion. But what we learned was that if you move it at the right range of motion, in the right velocity of movement, and then when the heel gets all the way to the top, you relax the muscle and it falls back down, and you repeat that in a very dynamic motion. So it's a rhythmical type of thing. It's not a fluttering like you see some people do. You might notice that a lot of people sit and they kind of jitter their legs. That's
right.
Not an intense soleus of activation. This is a little bit higher range of motion than that, meaning that the heel's going up higher. But it's also something we can teach people to do, and they can get good enough at it after, a couple hours of a lesson that they can be a research participant for some of these studies. And what's interesting to us is we didn't expect this either, is that we thought that there would be a learning curve that would be based more on the underlying physiology of people, meaning how healthy are they. And older people for example, might not pick up some exercises as quickly as a younger person because they have physical limitations. For example, if you have a bad knee or a bad back or hips, you might have some balance conditions. You might have orthostatic intolerance. You have other cardiovascular limitations. There's just all kinds of reasons that people have limitations to exercise. And it's not always a complete limitation, but it's enough to hold you back. Just common sense would say that we wouldn't ask a person who is elderly and maybe has some physical concerns to try to do the same thing as a young 20-year-old. And so, like I said, when we began this, I guess we kind of didn't know what to expect. We were maybe thinking that. And what we learned was that wasn't at all the case. And it was really, it's kind of neat to think that now we have people who are elderly can go out and, if they have the discipline, compete with their grandchildren if they wanted to, in terms of how much muscular activity can you infuse into your lifestyle. So let me put it to you this way, is that if the person doesn't have any physical limitation to doing the Soleus push-up, then what it means is that this muscle can be used for a very high local energy demand, where it uses a substrate like blood glucose or these bad lipoproteins that cause a lot of problems. It can use those fuels, and it can sustain that activity as long as the person is normally sitting. So we don't tell people to sit more than normal. We say that when you're sitting, this is something you can do. So in the research setting, for example, you might come in and we'd have people sit for a 3-hour oral glucose tolerance test. And that's a time that people might watch a couple of movies. Well, when you're doing the Soleus push-up, now you're spending that same amount of time. You're going to have to be sitting there anyhow, right? Instead of sitting at a low metabolic rate where muscle's not doing you as much good, now you can sit and let that Soleus muscle do you some good. So you're capitalizing upon something that's already inside of it. And we don't have to train this muscle for months to get it this special. It's naturally special. And people already are sitting. So it's really an interesting thing. Like I said, we have elderly research participants, and we don't exclude for that reason. Many exercise studies will do that. They'll have an age cutoff, and they'll say, what makes sense to compare a 20-year-old to an 80-year-old? And we say, well, in this case, there's no reason to exclude the 80-year-old. They can sit, and their soleus muscle is preserved well enough to be able to do this. And, again, the ankle joint doesn't have many problems. Partly you can imagine it's built a little bit more bulletproof because we do have to put the entire body weight on it with each step. Knees, obviously, backs, hips, all those shoulders have a lot more problems. The ankle is, it's preserved a little bit better, and it's just built differently. And of course, like I said, that all these other muscles that are working on these other joints are quite different than soleus. So, elderly are good, but then also it's important, if you want to age well, you got to start when you're young, right? So what we would say is that this is something that even if you're a regular exerciser and you consider yourself very physically fit, like you probably exercise a lot, you're probably very fit, but you're still not spending most of your day out exercising. You're spending your time, working at a desk or sitting to read, watch TV, do whatever you do. And so this is something that you can do during that time too. And so it's what you do when you're not exercising and you're not out doing other things. It's not an either or type of proposition. Most exercises, there is a little bit of competition. If you want to lift weights hard on Monday, you're probably going to have to take some time away from doing something else that you'd like to be doing, maybe another type of exercise. But in the case of the Soleus push-up, it's you have an opportunity to do it every day, and you have an opportunity to do it multiple times a day when you're sitting.
Yeah,
and that's why we say that we think of it as capitalizing upon something that's already in our body. Look, if you got this machinery and it's going to do you some good, then now we have a way of using it. And it's up to people get to decide how much they want to benefit. In the past with exercise, say something like walking or running or bicycling, weightlifting, you can reach a point where you do too much, right? Yeah, you injure yourself, or you can have all kinds of negative consequences. But those things are coming about from processes like we talked about before. One of them, the simple one, is fatigue. You run out of muscle glycogen. You're fatigued. That's when your legs are heavy. That's when you're tired. And the body's going through all kinds of neural and hormonal responses to keep that muscle working when you're trying to bicycle or run. And that's creating a big stress response. And you do too much of that, you're gonna harm yourself on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But with this, your heart rate's increasing, if anything, 5 or 10 beats a minute. So you're not hurting yourself there. However, the heart is providing more blood flow. And the reason for that is that when the heart's beating, there's 2 reasons why it can be a more powerful pump. One of those is that it can pump faster, meaning more cardiac contractions per minute. That's heart rate. But then the other is how much blood is pumped with each beat. And so the word for that is stroke volume. It just simply means that one stroke or one beat pushes out a certain amount of blood. And the stroke volume is very much influenced by soleus muscle contractions. And the reason for that is, especially in humans, is that we are like, you can think of our bodies as like a column of fluid where we've got these blood vessels, and there's the gravitational effect of on the blood that's in the blood vessels. And just like if you had a tube with fluid in it, you can imagine that the water in the tube is going to want to go downhill. It's going to want to go toward the bottom. And then that's the exact same thing that happens in our blood vessels, is that you can imagine that the blood that's in your veins is going to create more pressure. So that's going to tend to want to cause the veins in your calf muscles, the soleus, to fill up. And so when you do the soleus push-up, what happens is that muscle is surrounding these big veins that are down in your lower limb. And it squeezes that blood and pushes it back up to your chest, to where your heart is. So essentially the soleus is like a heart, functionally, but located in the lower limb, right above your ankle. And so it's able to pump the blood back uphill. And that's important for generating more blood flow through the soleus and through the rest of the body. But it's also important for draining some of the fluid that tends to accumulate. As we get older, we tend to have a lot more problems in these fluid balance issues. And one of them is just that we oftentimes have swollen ankles or swollen feet, especially after a long day of sitting and standing. And so this is a way to drain that. So it's more than glucose reduction. It's more than just lack of proteins. there's also these cardiovascular effects that are more directly impacted by these Soleus contractions. So we work with some people who are prone to getting blood clots. There's you probably heard of DVT, deep vein thrombosis, and that tends to happen much more prevalently in the veins in the soleus when people are inactive than in the veins, for example, in the arms or something like this. And so it's a condition that is in large part caused by a stagnant blood flow. Blood's not flowing; it can easily clot. And the proof of that, for example, is anybody ever had their blood drawn, meaning the phlebotomist, nurse or doctor would draw blood from your arm, and then they put it in a test tube. And if they leave it sitting there for even 20 minutes, that blood will clot and it's not flowing. However, and that's what happens in the veins in our legs if you're inactive for too long. And blood clotting is a big problem. Obviously, that's what causes stroke and heart attack and so on. And but when we do these Soleus push-ups, we're also able to keep the blood flowing through those Soleus veins, and blood literally cannot clot when you have a very high rate of blood flow, like we're talking about. So we work with people who have those type of conditions. It's not just diabetes prevention.
Yeah, so it's not only sitting that's bad, but also being standing in a single position all day that's bad because of the stagnation. So you need to move. That's the kind of most important thing.
In large part for our research, maybe start beginning about 30 years ago, started looking at what's going on at the molecular level during muscular inactivity. And my lab spent a lot of time studying this. And we quickly saw, even in one of our very first papers, that not all muscles were responding similar, meaning that a muscle like the soleus that naturally is geared up for doing great things for you during inactivity, even relatively short periods of inactivity, that muscle has large changes in the expression of genes that determine the quality of the muscle. And we saw that in the soleus more than we saw in other muscles. And like I said, it can be pretty rapid. It doesn't take weeks or months. And so when you start working the soleus all the time, though, now you can imagine that the exact opposite is happening. That muscle is now back to where it really wants to be and helping you. And we don't, when we started studying this inactivity physiology, what happened, unfortunately, it's kind of an interesting story, is that you do science in stages. And the first stage that we were studying was in animals. And we said that when we make their muscles inactive, lots of bad things are happening. And this is really important. This is a great take home point, is that those bad things that were happening when muscles got inactive weren't necessarily the opposite of what happens when you go and you exercise for an hour. And common sense would probably tell you that, but there's so much bias out there that exercise is so important for us that it must mop up all of the other problems we have in life. And that's not really the case. I mean, we need to exercise for certain reasons, but it doesn't mean that the stimulus during exercise is able to, for example, keep your muscle metabolism and keep that blood flowing all day long, just like we talked about earlier. When you stop your exercise value, the metabolic rate plummets back to resting levels. In about 30 seconds, you're already half of the way back to your inactive state. Within 3 minutes, your muscle metabolism is about where you started. And so we'd say that hour that you exercise is great for you for all kinds of reasons, but it's not great for you in terms of keeping muscle metabolism high and keeping blood flow high. By far a more potent way is just to keep the muscle working. And so that sitting that we do is bad. Now, like I said, the interesting part of all that is that what I just told you, I'd venture to say that most all of your audience is very logically thinking and says, I understand that's boring. That makes sense. But then when they go and they look at some of the things that are contrary to that, like, for example, go get a standing desk and stand all day. It's like, why would you think that would be the logical solution to sitting all day? They say, well, because you're not sitting anymore. You're standing. I say, yeah, but you could put somebody, you could hang somebody from their feet from a ceiling too, and they're not sitting. but that doesn't make it healthy. It's just different, right? And when you're using the standing desk and that kind of thing, when we measure metabolic rate, it's almost the exact same as sitting. It's not high. And you say, well, why would it be high? The body is very efficient when we're standing, and it doesn't need to do a lot. And then like you mentioned correctly, was that there's some vascular issues there. So we're not saying don't use a standing desk if you want to do it periodically as a break from sitting, maybe stretch your legs and, help your back, something like this. Or if you want to go out and you want to go on a short walk, that's fine. Go on some walks. That's good. But those brief breaks or that standing is not a very scientifically plausible solution to prolonged sitting. And I don't mean to be disparaging, but it's illogical. And the reason is that if the problems are that we have on average about 10 hours a day of sitting in a young, healthy person, more so in a person who has some health concerns. If we're spending 10 hours a day, 600 minutes a day, times 7 days a week, times 365 days a year, why do we think that a very small amount of muscle metabolism is the perfect antidote to that? It just doesn't make sense. And like I said, in our initial animal studies, we saw it very clearly. And there's all kinds of evidence for that now. But it's sometimes hard for people they think that it's impractical, for example, to be active all day. So then they say, well, then no, that's why I want to do. But now with the Soleus Pushup, we say it is practical to be much more active. You don't have to do Soleus Pushups 10 hours, but we see people oftentimes, like I said, including elderly people who have the desire to say, I want to do everything I can do to age well. I want to do everything that's under my control. And if I've got tissue in my body called Soleus that is functionally working and it can help me, then why would I not want to take advantage of it? And it does come down to some discipline. And some people would say, I don't have the discipline or the desire. Then, okay, you don't have to do it. But really, this is not designed for people like that. This is designed for people who I want to do everything under my control. And again, you don't have to take time out of the day.
Yeah, that's true. Like the movement is then the answer to
some kind of movement and the right dosage. You can imagine that this, what we call in science, the dose response, right? So in pharmaceutical research, they would say, you just don't take any dosage of a drug, right? You need to take a dosage that's potent. And imagine if somebody took a drug and it was very short-lived, meaning that its pharmacological effect only lasted while you were taking the drug. Okay. Let's say it was only working the hour that it was being absorbed from your gut. And then once it was fully absorbed, the body metabolized that drug, got rid of it, meaning very quickly within minutes. And now the drug had no more effect. So let's say you had a really bad migraine headache and you could take this drug and it would work for 30 minutes or an hour. But then as soon as your body finished absorbing it, it no longer was helping. Then you would say, I want a drug that's going to be sustaining that effect for many hours over the day. And I don't want to give half of a dosage. I want to give the full dosage. I want to get the full effect. And that's really what we're aiming for here with this research is what can we do to get this full magnitude of benefit of muscle metabolism, especially by a muscle that has the machinery for doing these good things for you. And how can we get that dosage not interfering with other processes that it's counteractive. And so we don't want to work the Soleus hard, for example, simultaneous to doing arm push-ups or something like this, because it's now going to, you're not going to do it for very long. And you're going to have these other processes counteracting it. So that's why we target the Soleus. We try to limit the use of other muscles when we're sitting, which is pretty easy to do when you're sitting. And then we sustain it for as many hours a day as the research study or in the real world people choose to do it.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So yeah, how long did participants do it in the study? I recall it was quite a lot of time. Well, and how much should people kind of try to aim for?
Sure. Well, the first question is how long did they do in the research study? So that we actually had a couple parts to that paper that you're reading. And the first part was we said, we want to understand how much fatigue is there. Now that study was exploratory in that sense. We didn't know how much fatigue would be there, and but we also wanted to take muscle biopsies so we could measure that glycogen that we talked about, and to also look at other molecular processes. And the remarkable thing, like we said, was people when they were doing the Soleus push-up, we didn't tell them. Remember, this is a first generation study, so it means that there wasn't any popularity to it. There were no podcasts, there were no people like yourself who were talking about it. And so we were honest with them. We told them we don't know if this is going to be healthy or whatever. We just want to know what your experience is here. And then we said but what we were impressed by was that in the initial preliminary studies we did, we were able to raise the level of activation of the soleus to very high levels. And we were able to get that energy demand much higher than if they were walking or even running. And so the lab staff was impressed with that, but we kind of, waited to disclose that publicly. And then, when the research participants were doing this, they would be talking to us and acting like they were, this is nothing. Why am I doing this for so many hours? We do it in the first group, we actually did it for about 4.5 hours. And we were really more limited by the amount of time that you can keep somebody in the lab when we could do this testing. And then the next study we came back with, we said, we're going to do an oral glucose tolerance test, which is where you ingest this glucose drink and you start in the fastest state, and then you ingest this glucose bolus, and then you typically will take blood samples. And we did about every 15 minutes for 180 minutes. So 3 hours. And what we did is we were able to test people while they were either sitting inactive, and we could measure metabolism. Specifically, we were interested in looking at how many grams of glucose the body was burning. And then we did it on different occasions, actually 3 different occasions. Once where they're sitting inactive, and then in a random order, we had them do Soleus push-ups on 2 other additional days. And they would also go for 180 minutes. But this time they were keeping that Soleus working throughout that whole 3-hour test. And again, there wasn't a progressive effort. Like if I asked somebody, even a fit person like yourself, if I say, go walk on a treadmill for 3 hours, you say walking's nothing to me, right? Because you're fit. Well, after the first hour, you start to get a little tired. And by the second hour, you say, I'm starting to get a little bit more tired. By the third hour, it's a pretty long walk, right? When you're doing Soleus push-ups, people didn't feel that. By the third hour, they were usually almost found it easier than the first because they were more kind of in a rhythm of doing it. It's sort of like if you're maybe sitting in a rocking chair, and you're getting the rhythm of it. You get the rhythm, and then right. You're not thinking about it. It's that easy. And of course, we had them instrumented with all kinds of devices that were giving us and the participants this real-time feedback to say, are they doing the Soleus push-up correctly? And are they keeping their metabolic rate at the targeting level? And unfortunately, there's not commercial equipment to do that kind of thing right now. But that we because of the enormous international interest, we got so many emails and so many people writing about it. Most of the people were in the media were just reporting about it in their own way. And then we had this international effect that we didn't anticipate at all, there are a lot of physicians who started teaching their patients. And physicians, they're busy. They don't have a whole lot of time. They're not going to contact me for help. And what they're going to do is just start doing it. And so to try to be responsive to that, we really aren't in the business of that kind of global media communications. But we did have some little services that we could provide. We created some YouTube videos, for example, or speaking to other people like yourself. And we could try to get that in the right direction. And really it's only right about now that we're able to start publishing some of these additional studies, and we're going to be able to hopefully communicate better in a mass way. But that's a long, tough ordeal when you're, it's not my day job.
Yeah. The YouTube videos are very good for like explaining and seeing it in action. And, I mean, it's like relatively simple. You pretty much understand it. You're doing like this almost like calf push-ups, but like you're doing
That's right.
in a slightly different manner. There's all these push-ups.
Yeah. And so practically, if somebody's listening to this and they say, I want to get started, I want to do something. What I would recommend is at first, you kind of think through, why are you doing it? And it really is important to understand that this is not a substitute for other kinds of exercise or whatever else you find valuable and important in your life. This is something that you simply say, I'm going to take the most unhealthy part of my lifestyle. And I don't think anybody would argue that all this inactive sitting that people is doing you any good. I mean, anybody who thinks that sitting for hours per day, 365 days a year is good for you is going to have trouble defending that argument. So then we would say, it's something you're already doing. Why not turn that most unhealthy time of your day into something that can be arguably the most healthy time of your day? I mean, think about it this way. As people are hungry to try to get 10,000 steps, and they might already be taking 5 or 6 or 7 or 8,000 steps from just normal everyday life. We go get 3,000 steps easily in 30 minutes. So they're trying to add those extra steps, and then they're setting a goal, and that they're doing all that. But that's 30 minutes. What we're telling people is, how would you like to add instead of 30 minutes of 3,000 steps? How would you like to add maybe 3 hours of 30,000 steps? And so what we really are arguing is that you can take the lid off the top of this limit as to how active can a human being be. So think about that for a while, is that from the standpoint of a researcher, it's pretty exciting. We're saying that what would happen to human physiology when we talked about some of it already? What would happen, for example, to human stroke volume? What would happen to the blood flow? What would happen to metabolism of glucose and lipoproteins if human beings could keep their metabolism high the whole waking day? Just that. And then when you go to sleep, you want to turn everything off and rest. Okay. But what would happen if you could do that? So we say, from a scientific standpoint, that's really cool. But then for the average person who's thinking, how much do I need to do? What you should be doing is thinking a little bit like that, to say, what could it mean to me personally if I could keep my metabolic and cardiovascular system humming all day long? Just think about that. I mean, and you say, and I don't have the barriers of lack of time. I don't have the barrier of overstressing my heart or harming a back or a joint. And I can still go out and do the gardening that I like to do. I can still go on walks. I can still actually do all those other things. This doesn't interfere with those things. And so it's an interesting way to think about it. So when people ask me questions that are contrary to that, I usually try to encourage them to think through it for themselves rather than preach to them. And I say, what's the minimum amount of Soleus push-ups that I should do? And I would say, minimum. Why do you want the minimum? It's just like, well, if we're saying I want to age well, you would say, but do I want to age a little bit better, or do I want to age a lot better? Why would you have advice on how to get a little effect? And that's really surprising me. And I think it's probably not that surprising if you really think about a lot of the ways that we've thought in the past, meaning that it's hard to encourage people or to lose weight and sustain it. It's hard to encourage people to exercise regularly. And they would say that there are some biological factors there, and we shouldn't stigmatize people for if they have trouble doing enough exercise and they have trouble sustaining metabolic processes. But in this case, we can take somebody who's obese and they oftentimes are the most motivated. We can take somebody who's elderly and they're the most motivated because they say, this is something I can do. And I've got a lot of willpower. I want to be much more healthy. And the best analogy I heard from all this, and I'll kind of slow down here. We'll probably run out of time. But a great point was that somebody was asking me about how much should I do this? I tried to explain it, like I said a second ago, some physiology. And then finally I said this, and it really resonated with him and the rest of the group was, I said, well, if I were to ask you, how much should you love somebody throughout the day that you really care for? If you went to a loved one, let's say one of your grandchildren, say, should you love them a little bit or should you give your whole heart, And I said, well, of course I wouldn't put a limit on it. I wouldn't put a cap on it. I would say, I'm going to give them my whole effort, as much time as I have, of course. I would display that love. And even when I'm not with them, I would want to be. I said, that's sort of the attitude, how we should think about healthy aging. If you can do something that will help you a lot, why would you want to put a lid on it and say, I just want to do it? What's the minimum of that? It makes no sense at all to think that way. It only makes that sense if it's harmful or if it's competing with other things that are important. You can't do two important things at once. So like I said, this is either or situation.
Yeah, you can do it in a lot of places and doesn't require extra time. Sure. So the question is like, have you been doing Soleus push-ups while during this podcast?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, fortunately there's a table here, but with me, I mean, again, I have the advantage, of course, of all that. I'm probably one of the most heavily studied human beings on earth right now, right? Because I have for years been able to look at what's going on inside my body with different types of things. And I can see it firsthand, but I don't think that we really need that. I don't think the average viewer needs to kind of get into hacking and measuring things on themselves too much with something like this. One, there's multiple benefits, but two is that go just simply ask yourself, is sitting and active doing me any good? It's not, right? That's a very simple question. You don't need to read 50 scientific papers to convince yourself of that. If you want to, we can give them to you. But that but then you would say, so would the alternative be much more healthy? Would it be better for me? And frankly, imagine if we were talking and I said that we had just developed the first drug that would activate brown adipose tissue, which is a tissue that's heavily studied. You probably have guessed about this. It activates brown adipose tissue to levels that previous drugs haven't been able to do. And it's been able to sustain that metabolic rate for many hours out of the day. People would say, wow, sign me up. I mean, they would say, give me a drug that would raise my muscle metabolism while I'm just sitting there. They would say wow, that's fantastic. I don't think a lot of people would be saying, how small could you make that dosage? Could you make it so it turns off within 30 minutes? Could you make it so it's only on for 3 days per week? You say, no, I want to take a bigger dose. That sounds fantastic. And that's what we're talking about. Now it's under your voluntary control. And you don't have to worry about the side effects of some pharmaceutical. This is something that's taking advantage. We use the expression capitalizing upon the soleus muscle that's already in.
Yeah. Well, great. We're going to put links to your YouTube channel to the show notes, and I'll actually overlay some of the movements as well, so people can actually visually see it. But before I ask my last question, where can people learn more about you and your work?
Okay, so one thing I would recommend people do is we have a very simple little website. Just these are a group of lab members that put it together. I'd go to our website. It's I think it's called soleusmetabolism.org. And then, like you said, we've got several these YouTube videos. What I would highly recommend when you do that, I would recommend people think about it more like a tool that you would want to reuse. So in other words, there's a lot in this conversation we just had in the last hour. And we try to condense those videos down short, and we try to provide readings for people that aren't overwhelming. But I think it's quite helpful. And we've seen this actually in the real world when people return to that on a regular basis and continue to reuse it and to think through things. Again, it's important to develop sort of the mindset that we've been talking about today. What's going on in me? So here's a great reason to return to those videos and to think through them and to do some reading and so on. Is that every time you sit down, use that sitting in a chair as a cue, as a reminder. Like, you might write a little sticky note sometimes and put it on your bathroom mirror to remind you of something you need to do that day. Your little sticky note is the sitting down. Every time you sit down, think, what's going on inside of me? remember what I was speaking about today. We talked about glucose metabolism. We talked about lipoproteins. We talked a little bit about the cardiovascular system from the heart, but we also talked about what's going on in the blood clotting in the legs. We could go on and on about inflammation. So all of those things can be, to some degree, improved upon by keeping muscle metabolism high throughout the day. And so then what we would say is that kind of visual cue of, I'm sitting down, here's what's going on, here's what I can do. And it's up to me as to how much I want to take care of this. Whether you're young or old, we all want to be more healthy. We all oftentimes don't do a lot about that because it's not always actionable, meaning that there's not something that we can do. Sometimes it's the environment we live in makes it difficult. In this case, the environment we live in is usually one that's filled with reasons to sit. And we've put devices on people, for example, that quantify this. And remarkably, over 95% of all people are sitting over 7 hours a day. That means that even if you have a job that demands that you're up on your feet, you get home from your work, you're probably going to be sitting to watch TV or use a computer, do something on your phone, have conversations, have meals. There's a lot of time. And so somebody even said, I'm going to start off with I'm going to set 2 times out of the day where I know I'm going to already be sitting. And now I'm going to try doing the Soleus push-ups. If you're doing it correctly, it's going to be very relaxing. So you don't have to kind of go from doing nothing to as good as maybe our research subjects did it. You're not instrumental with that. That's okay. Because what you're doing is you're starting to build a habit of something. And I always tell people the first month or two, don't even worry about how fast you move. Don't worry about the intensity. Just think simply about that I'm committed to this. I'm going to do it. And then after time, you can go back and look at some of the videos. We'll have more research articles that explain some of the techniques, how you can improve upon the quality. But the first step is just focus on making that commitment. And over time, when you get really committed, then you can start to increase the quality. And we do that with other things too. I mean, if you are learning a sport, for example, you don't have to go out and race people every day you do it. You're just building the habit of doing it and the enjoyment of it. And it's gratifying when you realize you're doing something good for yourself. And then over time, you'll get better at it. And you'll be a pro before you know it.
Right. Yeah, that's, I think, the most awesome thing about it.
Yeah.
That it's so simple and effective. And my last question is, what's this one piece of advice or habit that you wish you adopted sooner?
One piece of advice or a habit? Which one?
Just anything, like an idea or kind of recommendation or anything like that.
Adopted. Where you help me here?
Yeah, what you adopted. You wish you adopted sooner.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'll stick with muscle metabolism here. Okay. We'll stay in the theme that I actually, and this is, I'm going to make this point humbly because I think there's probably some other people could identify with this, is that I used to be under the mindset that the best exercise I could do would be one that would use as many muscles as possible. Because after all, we want all of our muscles to be fit. That's number one. And we would say, and number two, when a muscle's not working, it's not going to adapt to whatever exercise you're doing. Meaning if you're only using your legs to bicycle, your arms really aren't used. Your arms aren't going to adapt to it. So I said, you want to use a lot of muscles. And so we think about that. That's actually a very true statement. There's nothing wrong with that. But what it did is it caused me to miss developing the Soleus push-up for a long period of time. I mean, so I did over 20 years of research and we weren't even looking to develop the Soleus push-up. And I wish that I'd been more open-minded and said, well, what the large muscle mass exercise can do for me and others is by itself very important. But is there not something else too? You see, just because one thing is true doesn't mean that there can't be something else that's true. And so I wasn't looking for this. And it was under sort of like one of those things that's right under your nose all along, meaning we knew the Soleus was special. And we knew that if you keep muscle metabolism high all the day, that's going to be a very distinct, different kinds of physiological happenings than if you're inactive most of the day. But we didn't think, could the solution be just working a small muscle mass by itself? And with this study that we were talking about, what really opened up the doors to this was, as I thought a little bit more critically, and I said, if you model this, and this is an important point, and I'm glad that you asked this question. I should have said this earlier. If you model this in the most simple mathematics possible, you say, how many grams per minute does the human body need to burn in terms of glucose or the lipoprotein triglycerides in order to have a substantial, meaningful effect? How many grams are we talking about? And when you do the math, it turns out that the difference between a person with full-blown diabetes versus a person who has very healthy blood glucose levels, the difference is only about 100 milligrams per minute. Okay. So most people say, what's 100 milligrams of glucose look like? Well, I'll give you a picture of this. You actually have in your entire bloodstream, all of the blood, if I took all of the blood and extracted all of the glucose, you have about a teaspoon amount of sugar in your blood. Okay, it's 4 grams. 4 grams. We weigh out 4 grams of sugar tonight on your kitchen. That's all of the glucose that you have in your blood. Okay, that's it. And then I said, what's the difference between that glucose that's in the blood of a healthy fasting level versus a diabetic? It's an additional 4 grams, meaning that the normal blood glucose concentration is the threshold for what we'd call fasting glucose would be a little less than 100 milligrams per deciliter of blood. Okay. You don't have to remember that number. Just remember it's about 100. So the diabetic is 200. So the difference means that the diabetic has twice as much blood glucose in that fasting state. That's 4 grams of glucose. Weigh it out on a scale and look at it. And then we said, well, how much glucose is coming from the gut when you ingest carbohydrate? How fast is it coming into the system? How much is coming from the liver and so on? And then how fast is it getting out of the blood? And when you do the math, and we put these numbers in this paper, anybody can read them. It comes down to the fact that the simplest model that you can make would say that 100 milligrams per minute of extra blood glucose utilization would lower your blood glucose concentration by 50% or about 50 milligrams per deciliter during this postprandial period, meaning after you drink this big sugar drink that we've tested.
Yeah.
The results were almost spot on with that, which means that there's this old expression, Occam's razor, which is if you're going to try to explain something, explain it with the simplest explanation first before you get into this highfalutin kind of way of thinking. And so what we said was, we predicted this, and the results were consistent with it. It doesn't take a large amount of muscle metabolism. And then we said, well, how much muscle would we have to be working to get this 100 milligrams per minute? And the simple answer was not much. And this is the huge if that muscle wasn't using the other carbohydrate called glycogen that normally muscle burns. And so we said, we already had biopsied people. We already had learned that they don't use glycogen during Soleus pushups. So that opened the door to a very strong scientific hypothesis, which was, let's test it. And that's what we learned. When we saw the results, the very first subject we tested, I've got my windows open today. It's a nice, cool fall day. When we tested, the very first person we tested was an elderly lady. She was in her mid 80s. She had numerous health problems that I could go into here. And it was really eye-opening to me. Like I said, the first person we tested was a big challenge. And we measured her normal glucose response on one day when she was sitting inactive. And then, like I said, we measured it a couple more times where she did different levels of Soleus push-ups. And remarkably, her blood glucose was 100 milligrams per deciliter less. She was doing Soleus push-up. And she was just talking to us. It was just easy to do. And you don't want to bias the subjects and show them the results while you're testing them, those kinds of things. But you were tempted to. It was a stunning effect. And then we did this in all kinds of other people. And so again, it taught me to be a little bit more open-minded with ideas that we would sometimes say scientifically sound. It's scientifically sound to say use a large muscle mass. It's scientifically sound. But also I had been missing this. And the reason I took a long time to answer this last question of yours was it's remarkable to me how we can almost divide up human thinking. Roughly half of the people who are hearing what I'm talking about today are saying, wow, why haven't we thought of this before? This is great. I want to do this. Well, those kind of people are perhaps a little bit less biased, perhaps. There are the other half, though, and again, I don't know if it's 50%, but there's a large percentage of people out there who already have their mind made up about the best exercise is and fill in the blank. And scientists tend to be the most biased of all. And that's a shame. Scientists, they come up with things we call guidelines, which are human-derived how to be healthy, how to do something. And it's scientifically based. They look at the literature. But if all the literature has been ignoring something like this for years, there's not going to be a big literature. And so they oftentimes will say, yeah, but I'm going to wait till I see a whole bunch of other studies supporting it. Okay, you can do that. And again, I'm admitting that the mistake I made was much like that in the sense of saying, for a lot of years in my life, I missed out on being able to do something. You know, I wish that it didn't take till I was 60 years of age to be able to take advantage. I wish that I'd been doing this for years before. And like I said, the possibility was right there in front of me, but I was thinking the wrong thing.
Well, yeah, better late than never.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's a good way to think about it. And the good news about that expression that you just said was I shared with you some data where you can get these very short acting effects, meaning one doesn't have to, like if I was to say I wanted to increase my muscle mass, you're not going to see a change in your muscle mass in the first week, right? In fact, you might have to train for a long period of time to see any effect at all. And you have to be very consistent with it. And most people won't see that. So with something like this, though, that's working on processes that can happen almost instantaneously. The good news is that we all can start to turn around some of these health problems when people choose to do so.
Yeah. And I think we'll hopefully see some kind of, I guess, revolution or transformation in people's lives with doing the Soleus push-ups. So if you see people in the cafeteria doing it, then yeah.
Right. And if you had interviewed me, not that long ago in the recent history, several years ago, I would have been uncomfortable doing this kind of interview because I'd say, well, let's let science advance, that sort of thing. But and the reason we're talking today, and I'm glad to do so, is that the cat's sort of already out of the bag, meaning that when we published that paper, as I said up front, we didn't anticipate that there would be this level of international attention. And it's when I say attention, that's probably not the right word. I mean, it was an enthusiastic type of response. And again, we actually issued a press release only because the university I worked for wanted to do something. And I was sort of hesitant about doing that. And when we did it, look at that closely. It's the University of Houston issued this thing. It's about 3 minutes long. And you see how I'm trying to tell the public, be cautious here. This is a lab-based study. We're not trying to advocate for a change in lifestyle yet, these kinds of things. And then what we saw were literally millions of people who said, I want to do something good for myself, and it doesn't cost me money. And it's something that I can start doing now. And it's not this either or proposition. So we started to see people really a large uptake internationally. And so we decided if that's going to be happening, I need to at least, make more effort to try to help steer people in the right direction. And again, we haven't ended the research. There's still a lot to do. But what we've sort of done is we'd call this a natural experiment, meaning it's not one that you create a hypothesis for and guide. What we've seen, though, from this in the last couple of years, we've seen that people really do care about their health, especially healthy aging, and they really do have a lot more willpower and discipline than they've been given credit for. There are a lot of these environmental barriers, and there are a lot of physical barriers to how much people can exercise, and I don't doubt that. However, with this, what we've seen is those types of people, as I've said before, tend to be the most impressive. And they sometimes will email me and say, hey, doc, I could barely, walk, but guess what? I sit a lot and I'm doing this 5-6 hours a day. And we've done research studies and we have data to back that up. We'll be publishing that. And they say, and I'm glad to do it. And so it's when something doesn't have a large adverse effect, then we tend to be a little bit more open as scientists to say, let's go ahead and talk to the public and you're not going to harm yourself here. So it's an opportunity to really do more. And that's a unexpected consequence of what we did. So it's sort of a natural experiment. And how much are people willing and able to do?
Yeah. But well, thanks for coming to the show. Really appreciate it for taking the time. And thanks for also publishing the study, which I found really useful for a lot of people.
Well, good. I'm glad to help.
Yeah, and I'll see you around and looking forward to the future studies.
Okay, good. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Goodbye.
All right, that's it for this episode. Make sure you check out my new book, The Longevity Leap, on Amazon. I'd also appreciate if you share this episode with a friend or family member. Other than that, my name is Siim. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay empowered.